Welcome to the Forthright Gaming Podcast, making content for gamers by gamers. My name is Ian, and with me today is David. And today's podcast, we're going to be discussing the 25-year-old franchise that is Resident Evil.
Yeah, and this is an interesting series when you look at it overall. We were talking about how many games have really kept one storyline throughout the whole series, which is pretty rare. And this history of the game goes back to 1993 when a man named Shinji Mikami was working at Capcom's Osaka studio, and his boss basically came to him and said he wanted them to work on a horror game using the designs from Sweet Home, which was a simple NES game with horror elements, which was also based on the 1989 Japanese film. And that game, Sweet Home, is often considered to be the first survival horror game ever made. Now, when Shinji saw game development favoring 3D environments, we're talking about PlayStation 1 era here, the team tried their best to bring the game to life in full 3D, but given the limitations of PlayStation, they went with this mixed approach of 3D characters and assets along with 2D backgrounds, giving the game this highly stylized look, and thus Biohazard in Japan, or Resident Evil as we all know it, was born. So, Resident Evil is really more of a cinematic game, presented itself akin to Macabre Night of the Living Dead. It's got elements of corporate espionage, specialized militaristic weaponry, and character driven narratives. The music is ominous, the visuals had cutting edge graphics in each game, the main characters are strong, and the game's puzzles provide for a nice break from the relentless survival horror gameplay, which is something that really sets it apart from other titles even to this day. This has really enabled the series to sell well over 107 million games as of 2021. We're recording this here on May 9th, right? So it's no surprise as to why the series is so loved.
Yeah, and so the Resident Evil series is also especially known for the fact that it kind of brought zombies back into the mainstream. Like George Romero, who is the godfather of the zombie genre with Night of the Living Dead, Day of the Living Dead, and all the zombie movies that are well known for. And then Edgar Wright and Simon Pegg, who created Shaun of the Dead, they all credit Resident Evil for bringing zombies back into the 21st century. Edgar Wright and Simon Pegg even featured gameplay of Resident Evil 2 in one of their episodes of Space, which is one of the first shows that they were working on together, which also served as inspiration for Shaun of the Dead. But the big factor with it was that, like, zombie movies prior, even George Romero's zombies movies, they didn't have a real explanation as to why zombies were appearing. It's just kind of given the supernatural feel that the dead are rising from the grave and they're attacking the living. Even George Romero's zombies weren't out to eat brains; they were just zombies, right? But Resident Evil actually brought the concept that science instead of supernatural elements is what caused the zombie outbreak, making it the result of a virus and the result of a bioweapon that a pharmaceutical military company was basically working on creating. So it kind of brought it more to the modern times where it's like, okay, cool, we have zombies, we know why it's happening. And when you look at the whole kind of storyline of the Resident Evil games from like 1, 2, and 3 and whatnot, like in 1, you don't stop the outbreak. Your whole narrative is to just survive and escape. So you end up doing that, but it doesn't stop all the stuff that was already happening. Then Resident Evil 2 is following two characters in a huge metropolitan city with that outbreak having spread even worse. And same with 3 taking place based roughly around the same time as 2. So it kind of had like this concept that you're not the hero trying to stop the outbreak from happening and trying to prevent this from spreading. You're just a person who's kind of usually stuck in the situation and you're just trying to survive. And I think ultimately you stop something major from happening, but you're not stopping the initial outbreak, which is also kind of how the movies run too. This series, as we said, like 25 years, has 27 game iterations and like 7 live action movies, a plethora of animated movies which aren't even considered canon anymore. I don't think they're ever considered canon. They're just like, here's this cool Resident Evil movie, because some of the stuff that they ended up devolving to is just ridiculous. And this is actually a cool series to kind of look at. Hey, they went from a serious idea and then it kind of lost control of it, and then they reined it back in and kind of revitalized it and relaunched it to what we have now, which is the most recent titles, which is Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 8 The Village, which just came out a couple days ago on, May 7th, I believe, was launch day. So it's a very interesting story and franchise to follow because, like I said, you start off serious to where like you have some games in there that were considered canon, and later on they're maybe not considered canon, or they spawn off their own storyline elsewhere, which that was never finished. You have movies where it devolved into let's have a gunfight at point blank range between our two main characters, and that will look cool, right? And it looks the most ridiculous fucking thing you've ever seen, like a fist fight with guns, and they're not hitting each other or anything. It's some of the movies are really ridiculous as far as the animation stuff goes, and then the live action movies actually started off really good. I mean, Resident Evil 1 is probably considered one of the few movies that came out that everybody's like, well, this is a decent video game movie. It's not perfect, but it hits all the right elements, it hits all the right tones. This is still pretty cool. And then they just kind of devolve into silly action movies from there on. Um, Now, what was your first experience when playing Resident Evil?
So I had the Sega Saturn version, the original Resident Evil 1, and I mean, we can kind of go into this later a bit, but really, I think the downside was the Saturn was PlayStation did polygons based on triangles, right? Sega Saturn did it
Mm-hmm.
based on quadrants, so you had these four cornered shapes that it would have polygons as opposed to three cornered shapes, and because of that, the Saturn one looks especially blocky. The graphics weren't as good, and it was also somewhat censored. There was some censorship that occurred in the non-original releases, which they brought back later in the director's cut of Resident Evil. Um, but I liked it a lot at the time. It was very interesting. I think the main hard point when I try to go back to it is the tank controls. I fucking hate those tank controls. It's literally like it's literally like driving a tank. It's like you forward to move forward, left to turn left, right to turn right, and it doesn't feel very intuitive when you. I mean, bear in mind at the time, dual sticks weren't even around, right? Dual sticks didn't even come into the whole Resident Evil gameplay mechanics until the director's DualShock version had come out for Resident Evil 1, which was a re-release of the PlayStation 1 title. So that was my first experience. And then, I mean, you and I got into this probably more deeply when Code Veronica came out on the Dreamcast, which is great.
Well, I first played it, man. I remember this because this came out like I think the same year uh, Zelda Ocarina of Time came out. And I was at my cousin's house in Colorado, and like we literally like went to a Blockbuster, rented a PlayStation, rented an N64, picked up these games. And I remember us playing Resident Evil that night, and my cousin raving like, "Oh man, as live action video, the graphics are so good and all that." And at the time, the graphics were kind of cool on it, and the live action video was very cheesy, but it was like still fun to watch. That's another thing that this game is kind of known for is that it kind of melded video and game, where there's a lot of PC games like that, but they're very cheesy and kind of didn't really work all that well until like maybe a while later. But I remember us playing it at night, and yeah, the controls and the aesthetic are the things that stand out about this game because the 2D backgrounds, the 3D characters that you moved around, the 3D characters were the things that weren't always rendered the best, but the backgrounds were like looked like super high res for the time. Like, wow, this is like a really detailed dining room. You can see the shine coming off of the tile floor or the light emanating from the fireplace is reflected off the stuff because it's a static 2D image. And then the controls always being something that disorients you because until you play a Resident Evil game and you're used to playing it, it's that concept that you have to remember forward is always forward because as the camera angles constantly changed, your character was coming from different angles. And as long as you kept that concept down, you could always continually move. And then, of course, one thing everybody talks about in the first game is it had a good feel of suspense. And one of the biggest scenes that is always talked about that they didn't really throw it into the movies, but they had to reference it, which was the dogs. Is you run down a hallway, and then suddenly dogs burst through the window, and you're freaking out because there's not a slow moving zombie that's easy to take your time and aim at. They're fast moving, running animals that you have to try and shoot and not get killed by. And when they remade this game later on for the GameCube, they referenced it. Whereas where you would expect the dogs to break through the window, you hear them hit the window and fall. Like they weren't strong enough to hit it. Like, oh, cool, they're not gonna break through the window, so they're not gonna use the same scare. And then the next time you come through the hallway, they finally break through the window, and then you have to deal with the same thing again just to scare you. He's also known for Some of the cheesiest lines, such as I think when
Oh man.
one of the characters is trapped in a room with the ceiling collapsing, and she gets out. They say, "Oh wow, you almost became a Jill sandwich." It was really cheesy, but I remember playing through that one, and that was a lot of fun. But playing through the game I played through completely on my own was definitely Resident Evil 2, but I played it on the N64. And there you had like actually get an expanded storage drive for the console in order just to play this one game. But the one thing I don't remember, maybe you can tell me because I don't know if you played it, but I know with the remake they have the character Mr. X who just stalks you throughout the level. That supposedly is in the original game, but the one cool thing about Resident Evil 2 was it had two campaigns where you played as one male character and one female character, much like the first one. But if you beat the game with both campaigns, it was taking both campaigns at the same time and taking in account what you did in the first playthrough. So if like Leon was the one who found the keys to these certain rooms, Claire on your playthrough would find those rooms unlocked and find like different keys to different things. Like it instead of the first game where it was basically here's Chris Redfield's playthrough, here's Jill's playthrough. It was cool. Your playthrough is happening at the same time as your other one, and you could totally see the effects of those things. And supposedly in the original Resident Evil 2, Mr. X shows up in your second playthrough with the other character. I never experienced Mr. X on the game on the N64 version. I only have experienced him in the new remake. So maybe they cut that out because it's too violent with him stalking you. It was too hot, too tense or something. Because I know Nintendo really was big on censorship back then. But I mean, as far as I remember, I beat that game on 64. I don't remember Mr. X being in it at all. But a lot of people are saying, "Oh yeah, Mr. X was in the original Resident Evil 2."
He was definitely on PlayStation, but the thing is, I never played these games on the 64. I think I barely played Resident Evil 2 on the 64 because it was like cool to not have loading screens, you know. But that's honestly the only thing I really remember from 64 was no loading screens.
Yeah, and like the other thing is with these games, like we said, out of a lot of franchises that are as old as this one, like Mario or Zelda, those are all franchises that are one-off games of each other. They very rarely reference the game before it. There's no story line that kind of connects connects the games together. Where Resident Evil kind of has an ongoing storyline, and then they had some games come out that did branch to a different storyline that maybe they would continue, maybe they wouldn't. I feel like out of all the titles, the main core titles is definitely Resident Evil 1, Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3. We really, like you said, got into Resident Evil Code Veronica, but that I feel like is continuing from 2, but branching off to another storyline, which I feel like they don't really continue anywhere, and almost like now it's treated as if it's not canon. Resident Evil 4 continues from Resident Evil 2, and then Resident Evil 5 I feel like almost kind of ends the story because Resident Evil 5 is where you finally hunt down the guy you've been hunting down since the first game, and you defeat him by punching a boulder into a volcano. Apparently,
Yeah.
that's how the franchise kind of got way out of control. 6 was a complete like market failure where most people did not like that game. I haven't had a chance to play it, so I have no idea if it takes place after 5 or before 5 or where the storyline takes place there. But most people did not like it, and it's not referenced usually at anything. And then Resident Evil 7 is when they went and kind of finally rebooted it, which we'll talk a little bit about later on. And in between all this, there's Code Veronica, there's a few remakes, there's a bunch of light gun games.
Some co-op games.
Yeah, co-op games. There's a bunch of stuff in between here, which may not tie directly to the main storyline that you're following, but it ties to maybe something else, or there's a storyline going on within those games themselves.
Yeah, I want to say there was even a port they did for the Game Boy Advance, but I can't remember because that game in handheld would look terrible.
Yeah, I know. Like the one that's a big spin-off that was really popular was Revelations, because there's Revelations and Revelations 2, which was kind of, I think, originally released episodically on like Game Boy, maybe 3D, maybe one of the on the DS, not the 3DS, but the regular DS, that they ended up porting to consoles, to Xbox and whatnot. And you can actually now get, I think, a backwards compatible version of the Revelation series on Xbox One and even the Series X, Series S as a back compatible title. But those reports from a handheld game, usually handhelds don't aren't considered canon to the main console franchise. But like I said, it has lots of titles that all kind of tie together some way, or you can see where it's following a character from one of the main franchises. I think one of the ones that a lot of people were disappointed about was Resident Evil 4 kind of continued Leon Kennedy's story, but then it didn't go anywhere after that, because after that we went back to Chris Redfield being a steroid juked out football player looking guy, killing zombies in Africa and then killing Wesker in a volcano.
Well, maybe we should just start getting into the games especially for those who aren't too familiar, because, like you said, 25 years. I don't know if everybody remembers that much about this whole series.
Yeah, so where do you want to start at?
Well, let's start from the beginning. PlayStation era. To kind of break these down, we kind of broke them down by eras, because the way Capcom kind of planned these games out is they would kind of choose a platform of choice and then release essentially the best iteration of that game on that platform. And of course, later on, they did port some of these games. We're not going to get too long into the ports if we're going to mention them here, but we're really just going to focus on the first release, or in some cases, the best release. So PlayStation, the first one that started all, Resident Evil 1996, most fans will refer or prefer the director's cut, right, which had the DualShock. This one also was, remember we were talking about the Sega Saturn one. They had cut out some of the blood in the intro. They had kind of censored out some of the scenes in the original one when it left Japan from the initial release, when it was Biohazard, right? The director's cut was them bringing that stuff back, and then the DualShock, which was only on PlayStation, of course, actually used dual analog sticks, which made the game a lot more playable, in my opinion. Using it on a D-pad was pretty rough.
Yeah, and then in 1998 we had Resident Evil 2, which again was very much like the first one, where we had two campaigns to play, but the difference was those campaigns kind of intersected with each other. And then 99 had Resident Evil 3. And again, you got to think about this, right? 96, 98, 99, they came out with those games super quickly. Like, if you think about games nowadays in the franchises, like, was it BioShock? It's like one game every like 4 or 5 years, and like one even like seven. The last game came out 7 years in between the other ones. Even Halo has years between games that come out. Resident Evil just kept pumping game after game after game out.
I think
then you have Resident.
I was gonna say one thing that helped too is they actually had like a process in mind, right? Because Resident Evil 1, it's like kind of seems like a haunted mansion sort of ordeal, and then you realize, holy shit, this is like the base of operations of Umbrella, where they kind of lead to this outbreak. And then Resident Evil 2 is where you actually see the effects from the outbreak of Resident Evil 1. And then 3, I'm not too familiar where its place is in the storyline, but it kind of has that similar take, I thought, of Resident Evil 2.
Yeah, the thing is that Resident Evil 1 and 2 are definitely survival horror, right? It can be slow pace and like high stress, high tension game. And then Resident Evil 3, they wanted to make it more action based because there are some people are like, well, the games are too boring, they're too slow, right? The zombies are slow moving, they're just kind of bullet sponges. And once you kill the zombies or kill the enemies, you don't really have to worry about anything in those areas. So Resident Evil 3 kind of brought in the concept that they've kind of still used today, which is you're stalked by an enemy. So Resident 3 was called Nemesis, and there was this character Nemesis that from the beginning of the game is just trying to kill you, and you're running through the city during the initial major outbreak. So Resident Evil 2 kind of takes place the night after the major outbreak, and Resident Evil 3 takes place like during the day into the night, kind of around the same time. But you see the beginning of the outbreak, and then your character's running through the city while being hunted down by a bioweapon called Nemesis that's out strictly to kill you. So it was way more action based. So like fans of the series didn't quite care for it, but like new fans like, cool, it's more action based. They liked it. Now, Resident Evil Survivor, that was in 2000. I've never actually played that one. I don't know if you had.
I have. It's terrible. Don't recommend it. It was a game. That's all it was.
Yeah, so like you said, Code Veronica is kind of where we really got into, because I remember we had Dreamcast, we played through that game, and I think Code Veronica, one of the things that I kind of feel sad why I feel like it gets ignored is that it had some really good story elements to it. It continued diving deeper into the people who were creating the virus, what their whole backstory was. It brought Chris Redfield back into the game, and you had Claire from the second one, his sister. And it like was really focused a lot on cinematics. Like you had like, I remember you said there's one character in there we said like, here's the Leonardo DiCaprio clone because he's really popular right now, so they put him in there. they put sequences that were very cinematic and like literally just watching a movie happen as like these elements were going on.
One thing you're
So
not mentioning is the VMU. That was kind of like the big thing about it, right?
oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's
Why don't you explain that?
yeah, so for people who don't own a Dreamcast, the Dreamcast had a visual memory unit. This thing plugged into your controller, right, on the top of it, and it had this basically this open slot that was rectangular shaped where you would see the screen on it. And in Resident Evil Code Veronica, or actually any of the titles that were released on Dreamcast that were Resident Evil, it would show your health. So instead of you having to hit start, look at the thing that would show like your heartbeat, which would indicate your health status, you could just look down at your controller. So that was kind of like the big thing that the Dreamcast era had brought in. This was on top of the fact that it was higher power technology compared to, previous consoles by far. Even the PS2, which kind of saw a lot of these titles later, it was well above. You could tell that the Dreamcast was kind of like their option of choice when it came to Resident Evil. But the problem is the Dreamcast only had 2 years of life before it kind of was squashed.
Yeah, I mean the Dreamcast was definitely before its time, and it's definitely had a lot of ideas that were later implemented by other companies like Nintendo and whatnot. That were somewhat successful, but kind of over time they're like, yeah, I don't really want to look down at my controller away from the game action to check my health. But those were really cool elements at the time. Now moving on to the GameCube PS2 era, we basically had a Resident Evil Survivor Code Veronica, which I never played that one, but that was only released in Japan and Europe.
I've played it.
The one
I did play it. It's another like gun game in the Survivor series, but it takes
okay.
place in Code Veronica. So it was kind of cool that you could see the environment of Resident Evil, but the only problem is you have to use like a controller and a light gun at the same time. So
Oh, weird.
yeah, it wasn't the best, like
Yeah.
because you have to navigate how you move around with the gun to shoot. So it's like in some ways it seems cool. I would say play it if with two people if you're gonna play it, but yeah,
Yeah.
it's worth skipping.
Now, what I played a lot was the Resident Evil remake, where they basically on the GameCube took Resident Evil 1 and redid it with the newer engine, newer graphics. That's the first time I actually beat Resident Evil all the way through, and saw the whole story in its completeness. And the same year, they also came out Resident Evil Zero, which the story of Resident Evil is that you're a team of special forces going in to find out what happened to the first team that went in to go investigate the situation at this mansion. Resident Evil Zero is the story of what happened to that first team. And that rolls right into Resident Evil. So like those actually I think came out as a pair. I think Resident Evil Zero came out, and if you pre-ordered it or bought a special edition, you got Resident Evil Remake with it, so you can get the whole story. Again, then they had some light gun games like Dead Aim that came out in 2003, Resident Evil Outbreak in 2003, which was an online co-op, which I never played that one either.
That one
Did you have experience with that?
I played it offline. But what's interesting is that there are ways to still play it online. It's basically like playing in the Resident Evil universe with the traditional like tank controls and whatnot. It's not a very great game. It's strictly for people who just kind of want some multiplayer because that part is cool about it. But that's kind of where it ends for me. But that was on PS2.
Now, I'd say the next really big title, when you're looking at all these titles, which ones that people will really rave about or tell you to play, which will be, hey, play the 2002 remake of Resident Evil 1 because it's a remake of the original. Resident Evil 0 is okay, but I mean it gives you prequel story, and then Resident Evil 2 is highly beloved by lots of fans. 3, like I said, is kind of a hit and miss because it's more action based. So if you weren't into the action, the thing was with Resident Evil, because you had a static camera, the difficulty of the action and the gameplay of the game was making sure you're pointing your gun at the right area to shoot something, and not necessarily about hitting something in the head or the leg or anything like that. It's more like, am I pointing the gun in the right direction that the enemy is at, and will I hit him or miss him? Resident Evil 4 came out in 2005 on GameCube. I think that was its initial platform it released on was GameCube.
Yes.
And it was super hyped up. I remember this being a huge release. I remember getting it on launch day because it was cool. We're coming back. We're going to actually follow one of the characters from the second game, which we hadn't seen in any of the other games yet, which is Leon Kennedy, who went from being a street cop to now being a bodyguard for the President of the United States. And this is the first time they took it from being a static 2D environment with a 3D character moving through it to being a full like 3D action game and over the shoulder third person shooter to where you can now aim the gun at a head, at somebody's arm, somebody's leg. The characters would really react to it. Like you could, I think you could disarm people if you shot them in the hand. You could definitely shoot them in the knee, and it would make enemies fall to the ground, so you give yourself some breathing room. And you could prioritize headshots over just body shots to try and make the most use out of your limited resource of ammo. And then also kind of took the story out of, hey, this whole issue of Outbreak isn't just happening in Raccoon City in the U.S. It set this game in Spain and kind of set on the origins of where Umbrella, our antagonist, kind of got elements to create the virus that created the zombie outbreak.
Yeah, this game kind of set the new template, I would say, for where the modern storyline's kind of going and how it presents itself in the Resident Evil world. Because when you think about it, everything before this was zombies. Like it's somebody who would like succumb to the virus, die, and then he'd come back as a zombie. In this game, they talked, right? That I mean, I guess most people didn't understand what they're saying because they're all speaking Spanish. But I speak Spanish, and it was really creepy having a guy just kind of say "detrás de ti," and that basically means "I'm behind you." You know, or they just say "muere," like die, right? They would just say these very threatening things in very threatening ways, and a lot of that context, I would say, gets lost to non Spanish speakers. But if you are a Spanish speaker, it's a really creepy game, and it was cool that you had these zombies that were clearly coordinating efforts, whereas before it was kind of like a bunch of people in a room getting hungry and seeing food. They'd all just turn at you and slowly walk your way or run your way. Now they're coordinating, and you had more than
Yeah,
your
they could
typical
use
enemies.
ladders. They could use tools. There was a guy with a chainsaw that would run
Yeah.
after you. It definitely changed the whole aspect and made it more action based. It kind of took it. You saw the scientific elements of, hey, there's a corporation working on bioweaponry, and this is kind of where they got some of the stuff. But then it started kind of add a little bit more of that supernatural element of here you're in this old school village in Spain out in the middle of nowhere, and like there's a castle, and like they're kind of worshiping this kind of parasitic thing that they found that turned them into these monsters, but like not completely brain dead zombies, but I think they call them the Las Plagas or something
Yes.
in that
the,
game.
The plague, yeah.
Yeah. So you have these infected people, but they're not brain dead zombies. They're still functioning. They can attack you. They can use tools and all that, which definitely upped the action to it. And then I believe they took stuff from this game and threw it right into like the movie, like the laser hallway in Resident Evil 1 is straight out of Resident Evil 4. And when you got to the laboratory, like, Leon had to jump through lasers back and forth. They just didn't have like the grid one that comes out of the guy in the movie. But those are things that were very memorable. Like 4 is probably definitely up there with one of the best games that they came out with. Now, when we hit the PS3, Wii, and Xbox 360 era, only game I really played on the 30 that came out on this one was Resident Evil 5, which was out in 2009. But they did have Umbrella Chronicles in 2007, which was a co-op rail shooter. And then Resident Evil 5 came out, which was really big because it's going to be the first co-op, at least console co-op main game in the franchise. And they did it in an interesting way, right? Because one of the reasons why you can never play co-op in Resident Evil is like you can't have two characters fighting over the camera, right? We saw that happen with games like Fable 2,
Oh yeah.
and other ones where you had a co-op game, but you had two people fighting over where the camera was on one screen. And they wanted to make it couch co-op. So basically what they did was this cool kind of trick where they made it kind of a picture-in-picture. So instead of, if you had like a 50-inch TV, you wouldn't have a 50-inch image of the game. You would have a diagonal square of it, and then you'd have like another square. And they weren't complete diagonals of your TV. They kind of made them, I guess, like overlap a little bit. They did it in a weird way where it wasn't just your TV split in quadrants and two black ones and two filled ones. But they had it there so you both had a decent size view of what was going on, and you guys could both play on your own type of screen on one screen. I think it worked fairly well, but I can see why it didn't take off to go like, hey, let's do all co-op games like this, because people would buy big TVs to get the big theater experience with video games and movies, and then you'd only use a portion of it like this. So not exactly the best use of the technology as far as how to present your story. But this is the game where I say like the main canonical story kind of ends. Is that in the story of Resident Evil, you're betrayed by somebody in your team called Albert Wesker, who actually ends up being somebody who works for the Umbrella Corporation who started all this mess. Resident Evil 5, you finally track him down because he makes an appearance in almost all the games except Resident Evil 4, I think. But Resident Evil 5, you finally track him down, and you finally confront him, and you can finally finally kill him and take him out of the story. That for me is like cool. The story's done. Never played 6. I know 6 was an action-based one that took place in the city, and it was also co-op. You had more experience with that one. Maybe you can talk about 6.
Oh god, I honestly don't remember too much because I felt like the gameplay was very not Resident Evil. A lot of quick time events. I remember specifically there was one sequence that was very frustrating where you're grabbed by something and you're being pulled. I mean, Dead Space did something similar to this, right? We remember that in Dead Space where something like that happens with the mechanics, but in these games it just didn't feel as good. I wouldn't say that it felt rushed. It just felt like they were really trying so hard to do another co-op game that, Resident Evil 5 was a good blend of action horror, right? You still had some horror elements, you still had some action. I would say single player wise, it was kind of tough because if you were, Shiva, for example, you're whoever the second player you're not controlling, they would get messed up. If you do co-op, I feel like it was a lot easier to beat the game. This in 6, I would say the hard difficulty of it just wasn't as enticing of a story. I don't even remember much. I remember beating it on 360 and that's about it. But I really just remember being like, thank God it's over because I just didn't enjoy its story.
That's the thing, is that Resident Evil 6 pretty much, for all these games we're talking about, they're coming out like 2-3 years from each other. Resident Evil 6 pretty much killed the franchise on the main consoles. That was our last console real entry. The games that really came out after that were some experimental stuff. Then there was the DS games like Revelations 2 that were later ported to the console. And I'm just one, like, if it's a handheld game and it gets ported over, I'm pretty much not going to really play it because it's like, well, these are handheld graphics that just get slapped onto a bit more powerful computer that can run them faster.
They're not,
and then
they're honestly not that bad. I actually do enjoy Revelations. I think the co-op was good, but I think okay, like for example, I bought the pass, the Xbox Resident Evil Revelations pass on the 360, and I remember I was like, how the fuck do I get the rest of these chapters? Like, I just paid for this. How do I get the chapters? And I bought the game and the chapters on the 360's store, right? You have to go in the game and then download them all. It basically says you've already purchased them. You have to purchase them download them through the in-game menu. If you don't know about that, like I did, it's frustrating because like you'll play the game and you're like, now I can't go any further because I'm missing the content. But you're not really missing the content. It's because the way it works out. I mean, now with Xbox One, PS4, PS5, Xbox Series X, it'll just download everything for you when you buy a Game Pass, right? These older systems don't really do that for you, and that's what was so frustrating.
yeah, and they're trying to like make it episodic anyway. Like, hey, we came out with this chapter, and then a few months will come out with another chapter. That was at a time where they're doing it with quite a few different games, and it just never really worked out very well. I mean, even the games that were known for this, like the Telltale games that are like, hey, we're do episodic gaming, they couldn't get the episodes up because they weren't making them in the can, like how you do a TV show. You film your whole series during a certain time of the year, you get it edited, and then you have 12 episodes in the can. And then maybe you're filming episodes every week after that, but you're not stalling the show because you're waiting for the next episode to get made. They constantly were stalling stuff, waiting for them to finish the games, to where it broke it up. And the Revelation story never gets referenced again in any of the main storylines. It does follow, I believe, Jill, right?
Which
Does
one?
it follow Jill? No, Revelations. Is it Jill or Claire that it follows?
Oh no, that's Jill. I'm pretty sure it's Jill.
Okay, so yeah, I think so they follow Jill, who is the other main character in the first game, and follows kind of her storyline, but it never gets referenced on anything else. Now, with this long break from 2009 to 2017 is where we get our next mainstay Resident Evil game, but it's more of a reboot. But it's kind of weird because they don't say, hey, we're rebooting the series. They just say, hey, it's Resident Evil 7. But it never references anything from the previous games. It does have some of the previous games' characters, but they're doing something different. Where Resident Evil 7, I felt like they took a long break and they looked at the horror genre of all in as a whole, not just in video games but as pop culture, and notice that hey, you have games like Outlast, you have games like Amnesia in gaming, you have movies like as above, so below, and found footage stuff is really taking off big right now because people have been able to execute a found footage horror film fairly well and make it very entertaining. And games have started copying that kind of concept as well. But the one nice thing about Resident Evil is that unlike Amnesia or um, some of those other found footage games, you're able to actually fight back, which is what I always like. Is that the flow of Resident Evil is you're scared at first and you feel weak, then you get a good shotgun, and then you're like, okay, I believe in the power of the shotgun, and then you fucking just rail through everybody, and like you feel strong and invincible, so you kind of overcome your fear and fight back instead of being scared of everything. Where in other games like Outlast, you have to just run away from everything and just try to survive.
Don't forget the big shift here. You know, we went from 2D backgrounds, 3D characters, and props, right? Then we went to full 3D environments and characters. This was the first time they dropped the third person camera and went with a full blown first person. And this was a deliberate decision because, and I think this is a good one. When you look at it, it's hard to get scared in third person because you're looking at the character, you're not really being the character. But now you're in first person and you can be the character. And this was the first game that had VR support on the PlayStation 4. And I remember I played this at a buddy's house and he was like, dude, you got to play this scene. This scene's fucked up. I'm like, okay, what am I doing? And there's like a scene where you got to put your hand in like this guy's, like this corpse's neck and grab a key out, or I think it was a key, some sort of thing you pull out of it. I can't remember. And I just remember doing this in VR. I'm like, dude, this is disgusting. I don't want to do
Yeah,
this.
that's the thing. That's why, like I mentioned, found footage because it's in first person, and so you're playing now a horror game and a Resident Evil game in first person, in kind of a found footage format, where like you have a flashlight, it's dimly lit, but hey, you have a gun. But hey, now the enemies you're fighting aren't slow moving zombies or lumbering things. You have the element of the redneck family in Louisiana that is just murdering people. And you follow the story of a guy named Ethan Winters, whose wife disappeared for 3 years. Apparently, he gets a message from her saying, hey, come get me in Louisiana at this address. Why he doesn't go to the cops, who knows? He just goes out there and finds himself captured by this family. And again, like a lot of Resident Evil games, it starts off in a house or in an area, and it seems supernatural. And then you get to a point where like the game ends more towards, all right, you're in a lab and you understand how this stuff understands that this was manufactured and somebody was studying it, and this is not a supernatural element. This was a disaster that happened, and this family, who were the villains, were actually victims of what happened, of the outbreak that happened, and you basically had to go through and kill them to get to your wife and whatnot. Then after that, that was with a new engine called the Re-engine, which also definitely upped the graphics and made everything look really well. Now, with the popularity of that kind of revitalized Resident Evil. It was like, wow, this looks great. You got to remake some of the old games with this engine, right? Because it'll look awesome. So then they remade Resident Evil 2 in 2019. And then they also remade Resident Evil 3 in 2020. So now we're back on that schedule of 2 to 3 years. There's a new game coming out. Because they have a new engine, they have a plan. They wanted to completely remake Resident Evil 2, not just do a remaster like they did with Resident Evil 1. So the game is the same, but yet different. There's different elements. It starts out differently. They definitely added stuff. Like I said, they added Mr. X, who is a stalker character who basically stalks you throughout the entire game. Like I said, people said he was in the original one, but like on the N64 version, I don't recall him being there at all. But that made add more tension, where there's a character now that if you fire off your gun, he'll hear you and he'll come straight for you, and you cannot kill him. You literally have to avoid him and survive until you get to a point where he actually dies. But it follows the same story as Resident Evil 2, but it doesn't do it exactly the same way, which is nice. So it had lots of callbacks to the game, but it was new. And then they remade Resident Evil 3, which again was more action based, but done a lot better with this engine. Instead of having the 2D backgrounds and 3D sprite and having a hard time trying to aim, you now had the action of the 3D environment and a really good mixture. I feel like some quick time events, some action, it just it actually probably looks really good. It's a really good game to kind of play through. And then also that also kind of came with their first attempt, no, not the first attempt, but an attempt at co-op for this generation using the free engine, which was Resistance. That just kind of failed because it was just too complicated. It was a cool idea where you had one player be the mastermind evil person running the game, and you had four people who were survivors who basically had to survive this gauntlet, kind of like a Saw game almost. Of you have the crazy person who sets all the traps, places all the enemies, and you had four people who had to find keys and things to work their way through the facility and get out. But it was overly complicated. It took like 30 minutes to get through the tutorial, where it's like very apparent to anybody. It's like, if it takes this long to teach you how to play, then your game's not good. It has to be easy to pick up and easy for everybody to play as either the mastermind or as a survivor. So that kind of just fell to the wayside.
The worst thing was it just didn't fit.
Yeah, it felt like they're trying to be capitalize on the Dead by Daylight success of survivors and a killer, but the killer just basically used a card deck system to sit there and divvy out monsters in different spots and spawn them, then spawn a nemesis or a boss character. But like, if the survivors or coordinators stuck together, they just take everything out and they get out of the game anyway. So it's like, it wasn't very fun on either side. Like, if you were a survivor and you had a bunch of lone wolves, then yeah, everybody fucking died. If you were a mastermind, everybody worked together, they completely just ran over anything you did. So really, I feel like that was a really failed attempt at them trying to capitalize on an idea someone else had. And then Resident Evil 8 just came out, 2021. So boom, 1 year later, they come out with a brand new mainstay title in the franchise. Now this one is taking place directly after Resident Evil 7, references the events of Resident Evil 7. As I said, those games don't reference anything that happened prior to this. You just do still have Chris Redfield, but in this, what's kind of a flip in this universe is that Chris Redfield is now working for Umbrella instead of fighting Umbrella. But yeah, I think I haven't beat Resident Evil 8 yet, obviously, since it just came out, but I'm thinking that they could tie this back to the older games, depending on what they explain. But as far as I look right now, it looks like it's just referencing Resident Evil 7. And the weird thing with 7 and 8 is that Umbrella is a entity there, but we don't know, are they the villain or are they the good guys? And I think 8 is kind of going to reveal that they may be the villains, or they're involved somehow, but we just don't know directly how. Where the original franchise, Umbrella is the corporation. They found this parasite. They're going to make a bioweapon out of it, and they lose control of it, and then that's how the outbreaks happen. Where 7 and 8, we don't quite understand what their role is, because they don't show up in 7 until the very end to clean up the situation after you've defeated everything. And then in 8, it seems like you're part of Umbrella, but not really. Like, you're still left in the dark about what the hell's going on. But Resident Evil 8 also now has another attempt at multiplayer, which they ended up delaying after the beta to tweak it some more. And it's going to come out sometime this summer, called Resident Evil Reverse, which is just a straight up deathmatch. I think it's a 4-on-4 deathmatch. The gimmick here, though, is you play as some of the main characters in the franchise, such as Leon or Claire or Chris, or Ada Wong, or some of the other characters that have shown up throughout the series. But when you die, depending on collectibles you've picked up throughout the match, you'll turn into a bioweapon. Either you'll be a very weak bioweapon from like Resident Evil 7, like a mold man, or you could turn into the nemesis or one of the boss characters, depending on what you've picked up, to be an even harder character to kill, which seemed like a cool element. When I watched people play the beta, it looked like a lot of fun. But I was kind of disappointed that it didn't come out with the game, so that means they're definitely retweaking it.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of where we are today. When I actually saw Reverse, though, I was a little worried because I was like, oh my God, I'm getting hints of Umbrella Corps on this one.
And the problem with Umbrella Corps, I believe, was that they're trying to make it an esports game. There's a time when almost everybody, if they're coming out a multiplayer game, they're like, let's make it an esport, because if it's an esport, we'll get sponsorships, it'll be on TV, and people will love to play esports, right? And almost every game that they did that focus with fell on their fucking face. Like, esports games are just the MOBAs and like CSGO that's it. Like there are like in-house tournaments for Halo and other things, but they never blew up as big as the MOBA esports games did. And I remember Evolve, they tried to market that as an esport game, and
Oh
that
yeah.
fell completely on its face. So it's like games will either be really good multiplayer and they'll just turn into an esports game, or they'll just be a game that people will play. It's weird how that works, and so something else we can talk about in another podcast on how the whole esports thing kind of took stuff over. But that's the whole series as it is from now. And like I said, it feels like the mainstay titles is 1 through 5 that basically tell that story. 6, man, who cares about that? 7 completely reboots the series with a new character and kind of a new storyline. 8's continuing that, and 8's kind of like, real honestly, it's the successor to Resident Evil 4, where you're now back in an area where it seems like there's more of a supernatural element to it that's probably going to be revealed to be more scientific later on. Um, but you're definitely going through dealing with uh, enemies that aren't just lumbering zombies and just sitting there wandering back and forth. You have like werewolf type characters, lycans, who will dodge and jitter around and move. You have some like vampire/witch like sub bosses you have to fight. And it basically, the way this game is unfolding for me right now, because I'm only like maybe a quarter way through it, is that you're gonna have 4 bosses and then one final boss at the end of the game, and they're gonna go through 4 different environments. The main ones are the castle, which they've talked about with the demos and whatnot, and everybody's talking about the tall vampire lady that everybody loves. Sorry, you'd be disappointed. She's the first boss, and once you're done with her, you're done with her.
So,
um,
so what's your favorite? If you had to pick top 2 out of all the iterations, doesn't matter if it's a port or whatnot. What are your top 2
I
favorites?
I would say Resident Evil 2, and then I'm actually enjoying 8 more than 7 because it's more action and more exploration versus 7. I felt very claustrophobic being stuck in this like house in this plantation area. And 7 didn't have a huge variety of enemies. You literally just had, here's mold men, and then here's a mold man that's on all fours that's fast. And that's basically it, other than the family members who would only come out for boss fights. But 8, I think, does a good job of implementing the stalking element that Mr. X is in 2, but without doing it to where it's a pain in the butt. Like, literally, Mr. X makes playing 2 kind of hard to play because, like I said, once he gets introduced, if you fire off a gun on the other side of the map, he beelines it directly there. And he will enter sometimes safe spaces like the main hall in Resident Evil 2 that is normally a safe space to save your game, dump your items in your storage box. He has to use that area to get to the other side of the building, so he will walk in there and chase you around the hall, and he's he's impossible to kill. Where in 8, the stalking character is the tall vampire lady, Demistru or something. I can't remember how you pronounce her name, but she's easy enough to juke. And it seems like they kind of restricted where she can go when she starts stalking you to only a few certain areas. Because I've definitely felt the stress of like, is she going to show up if I start firing my gun off to do this, or if I keep breaking vases to get item pickups? Is she going to hear that? It seems like that's not a thing in Resident Evil 8. At least not on the mode I'm playing. I'm playing on easy, but she doesn't show up every time you do something. She only shows up in certain areas where you have enough room where you can kind of comfortably get away from her and get through a door where she won't follow you. But it also feels like that's only one part of the game instead of you being stalked the entire game. I haven't gotten to the second. I just now got to the second, basically the second level, and it's throwing a whole new game mechanic at me. Like, as you heard us playing earlier, it's like, oh crap, they just took all my guns and weapons away from me. Like, what the fuck? So I feel like the different 4 levels you're going to play through, they're going to have a different mechanic for each of them, which will make that a lot more enjoyable. So those would be my 2 picks. Is definitely 2 and 8.
2 and 8. Yeah, I'm a little different on this one. I know 4 is probably my favorite, but I think the Spanish probably plays a strong part in that. Really creepy. I really like the fact that you're kind of I like the idea of you going to this town and you're kind of like on your own, right? And I also like the cheesy campiness. I mean, 8 kind of has something similar with the salesman guy, but in 4 it's like, what are you buying? What are you selling? You know, I'll sell it for a high price. Like, I love that cheesiness of like, all right, I almost got killed by these dudes speaking Spanish, and Leon, to my knowledge, doesn't speak Spanish because they don't show subtitles explaining what the hell they're saying. But I like the fact that all of a sudden he somehow meets this guy who speaks English, and not only that, can sell goods without being harmed in all these different locations. Is this? I don't know. It kind of. I think it plays very well from both like a slight comedy and a horror. That sales guy really did a good job of breaking up the story, and I like the bosses a lot.
And they do the same thing in 8 because the merchant that you have in 8 called the Duke does almost the same thing where like he actually gives you good story points and it plays more of a bigger character in what's going on, but he's ultimately there to help you to sell you weapons and items just like the merchant does in 4. And when you're browsing his store, he'll go, "What are you buying?" That's what one of my colleagues used to say. So they definitely reference 4 a lot, and that's why it feels like 8 is an upgraded version of 4 with just a little bit different story and better gunplay and whatnot. And you have a definite focus on here's an area boss versus Nemesis, where it's just one boss is constantly chasing you. You have to figure out different ways to take them down. Or 2, there is a big boss who's running around, and every time you run into him, you have to kind of figure out a different way to get around him or take him down. This is like, all right, cool. There's the 4 lords here who pray to this one, who have this one person they all answer to. You need to go to each of their areas, get a specific item from them, but they're all very different. One's a tall vampire lady, one's a tiny puppet, one's a kind of a grotesque looking mutated guy who like lives in water. The other one's another human being who has telekinetic powers, basically. You're going to have to go through all their different stuff very differently and fight them all through different methods. Ultimately, I'm pretty sure what's going to happen, the same thing that happens in most Resident Evil games, is when you fight the final boss, they're going to turn into some grotesque giant monster. You got to kill that thing, and then you'll move on to the next level. And then the last boss will be like a multi-phase boss where it's human, it's monster, and now it's some giant like skyscraper-sized monster that you have to kill. As they did like since Veronica, I think that's when they really started doing that. Is like, oh, everything just starts mutating and getting worse and worse and worse until you finally kill it. I think in Nemesis they actually did that too, where the Nemesis turns into this giant blob thing that you just kill.
I remember Nemesis. I barely played it, but yeah, I mean, Resident Evil 4 is definitely my favorite. But I like co-op. So Resident Evil 5, those are probably my top 2 I'd recommend. If you like co-op, I recommend it. My wife and I, we beat 5. I think the only thing that sucked about 5 is the ending of the game where you're fighting in that damn volcano pit. It's button mashing and like quick time events, and it sucks. We played it on easy, hoping we could still get through that stupid part. We eventually gave up after like I want to say like 20 tries. For 20 tries, we're like, you know what? I can't quick time event this, button mash this every time perfectly. So we just went on YouTube and watched the ending. We're like, we're good. we don't need to watch this.
See, I feel like 5 is where it definitely jumps the shark as being okay. We're gonna go over the top, unrealistic, and like almost follow where the movies went. Where their movies go like really crazy and unrealistic, to where they have to retcon themselves to make their main character weak again, to actually make it a horror movie. Because I think like by the end of Resident Evil 3's movie, the main character has superpowers and can kill everything, and then they had to like take that away from her to make like another 7 movies that they made.
Oh yeah.
So like in 5, it gets to that point where it's like, all right, we're just at a ridiculous action scene. And it is literally Wesker falls in a volcano pit, and they keep him down in the lava. You punch a boulder into a pit. It's so fucking stupid. So that's where I feel like they definitely jumped the shark, and that's where you see that major pause where they go to Resident Evil 6. That completely flopped as a co-op game and story-wise. Nobody liked it. And then they kind of took it back and they reined the franchise back in and said, okay, let's go back to horror. And Resident Evil 7 is legitimately scary with more jump scares, where I feel like 8 is now kind of a remake of Resident Evil 4 with more action, but just as intense scares and thrills in there as well.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean this series is pretty interesting. Like you said, this is one of the most influential video games of all time. Revitalized the zombie genre. First game to get the rated M 17+ rating. The evolution of the Resident Evil series is an interesting one when you look at the games as a whole and how the focus changed and needed to be reined back in. And it's still really rare to see a game go this long with a single ongoing storyline. And it's in a unique position as most franchises will typically go with a standalone title, like you mentioned Zelda, right? Wind Waker isn't really connected to the next one. And the only other franchises that we've talked about, we tried to actually figure this out. The only games that really had a continuing storyline across multiple titles in a single lore are like Elder Scrolls, Mortal Kombat, Metal Gear, Metroid, and Castlevania. The rest will switch it up.
And even there's like Mortal Kombat. I think like 1, 2, and 3 kind of connect, and after that, it's kind of like they're kind of retcon some stuff. Elder Scrolls, it does take place in the same world, and the events you did in the past are referenced, but they're referenced like this happened 1,000 years ago. Like there's giant breaks of time in between what happened on those games, and they never reference specific things that your character actually did because you're not importing a save or anything. They're just referencing major events of the prior games, right? Like, hey, the volcano in Morrowind exploded at this time. It's like, well, yeah, that's because in Morrowind game I did this, but they don't reference all the different things that you could have done in Morrowind, right? And again, there's that long distance there. And then like games like Castlevania kind of follow a storyline, and then they rebooted it to have a different storyline. And then other ones kind of felt like Metroid, like Prime was its own kind of branching storyline that didn't really reference any of the prior games. And then that one fell off, and nobody really knows what's going on with Metroid anymore. And Metal Gear is like, it's a Kojima game. It's gonna have some crazy shit. Like they connect, but their big connecting thing is like nuclear war. How do we avoid it? It's like we've had like 6 games already, guys. We haven't figured out how to avoid it yet.
Yeah, that's definitely true. But I mean, Metal Gear was probably one of the few that actually did connect well. I mean, you did have the, what was it, MSX, NES versions of it, where you kind of get the hints of where he was going with before Metal Gear Solid came around. But Metal Gear Solid was like a whole reinvention of that, which was amazing. But
I feel like the Metal Gear Solid franchise kind of goes to the NES ones. It's like NES ones were like basic, like games of their time. The Metal Gear Solid one goes back and like helps bring those games back into their lore, and then goes on with its own storyline as it goes. But yeah, it gets weird. It's like after 2, I stopped paying attention to the story of Metal Gear Solid.
It's funny you mentioned Wesker, the whole 1 to 5 story, because that kind of really is the basis of it. I mean, for those who do know, in Resident Evil 1, Wesker's with you when you enter the house at the very beginning, when your whole squad gets attacked, right? When I think you're Alpha Team, Bravo Team. I can't remember which one you are.
You're Bravo Team because Bravo Team went in first, and you're Alpha Team, or vice versa.
Yeah, I can't remember.
You're in there, and he's the commanding officer of your team. So the whole kind of driving point of Resident Evil is that not only are you trying to survive the horrors that are being put in front of you, you're out to get the guy who betrayed you and basically killed your entire team, all for a bioweapon experiment. And that's why throughout all the games, even with Code Veronica and some of the side ones, you're chasing Wesker. Wesker finally gets his comeuppance in 5. That's why I feel like that's where the story ends, and then they basically reboot it in 7. But the thing with 7 is that they kind of said it's not a reboot. We're not redoing the series from scratch. But the story has nothing to do with what happened prior. And the thing is, Chris Redfield, who's the main hero in the franchise, is working for Umbrella. So it's almost as if Chris Redfield is now the Wesker, but we don't know what his real main role is. And Resident Evil 8 definitely points him out to be an antagonist, because that game starts off with him killing your wife and kidnapping your baby. And you're like, what the hell's going on, Chris? And all he tells you is, no, stop. And then they knock you out. And you're like, what the fuck's going on? I think I'll tell you like after this, but I think Courtney, just by watching it, I bet she's figured out what happens in this game, just from a few hints that they give at the beginning. But it's like classic Resident Evil, where they give you one hint and then they make you forget about it for the entire game, so you're surprised at the end when they pull it out as a twist.
Yeah, I still have to watch Village, or commonly we're referring Resident Evil 8, but Village looks interesting. I haven't had much time since this just came out.
Yeah, I'd say it's a lot of fun. But now, if you want to talk about like kind of the best versions of each title to pick up, we do have like a list of titles that we would recommend that people go and grab and play.
Yeah, consider this like a collector's conversation, right? If you're just looking for the best versions to own in your actual collection. So we have some recommendations on certain platforms. So the general mindset is you're just looking for the best version. So understand we're not trying to focus on a budget sort of on this sort of ordeal. And if you're a PC gamer or if you're in emulation, that's also an option on the table. But please note that we don't condone piracy of any kind. So do what you can to support these great developers so we can see more great Resident Evil games. And PC, you're in a unique place because you can use mods, you can put on more costumes and stuff. So we're gonna probably be mainly focusing in here on just the console iteration. So, kind of starting with that, we do not recommend you pick up Resident Evil Survivor for PlayStation 1, Resident Evil 6, Operation Raccoon City, Umbrella Corps, or Resistance. They're just not even worth looking at least in my opinion. I don't know how you feel.
Oh, I definitely agree. Like, don't you can skip all those titles.
Yeah. And then if you like Resident Evil 1, not the remake, but just 1, I recommend the DualShock Director's Cut on PlayStation. That one's really good. And if you have a Dreamcast, I actually thought the original 2, 3, and Code Veronica were really good on that. You had the VMU, the graphics were really good. If you have a modded Dreamcast with the GDEMU in it, the load times are pretty damn fast, which is pretty cool. So this is where it gets a little controversial, though. GameCube, Resident Evil 4. The re-releases of Resident Evil 4 have a lot of issues. Yes, you can get a higher resolution. Yes, you can get a higher frame rate, but the issues are abound. You could look up Digital Foundry Resident Evil 4 just for just some of the issues found. For example, the hand animations on firing a gun are like at 30 frames a second, but then the game's at 60 frames a second. So you kind of have these horrible looking animations on this high speed, high resolution frame. It doesn't look good. The environment just looked better at a lower resolution. I mean, one thing to bear in mind, when the original PlayStation games were out, we're talking 320 by 240. That's how many pixels these games have. Now we're talking about 1080p, 1920 by 1080, much higher resolution. The textures of the Resident Evil 4 game looked much better on a GameCube. I know it didn't really do a proper 480p, you had the black bars and stuff because it was originally meant for a CRT screen, right? 4:3 aspect ratio. But I really thought that the GameCube Resident Evil 4 version was the best one. I could go on and on about it, but really, just trust me when I say I've heavily researched this game because this one's my favorite. The GameCube one's the best one to go, hands down. Some of the more abstract titles, PS2, Resident Evil Dead Aim. That's the light gun required game. CRT is required for that. Outbreak. That one's actually still playable using what's called the Outbreak server. If you're interested in that, go ahead and look it up. It's also playable with the PCSX2 emulator. So if you have the game, you want to play it with the emulator on your PC with higher resolution, you can go ahead and do it and just set it up for the Outbreak server and still play online, which is pretty cool actually. And then there's also the Resident Evil Survivor Code Veronica game. I like it because I like Code Veronica, but I would say if you're not in the Lycan games, you could skip Date Aim, you can skip Code Veronica. Now, on the PS3 era and Xbox 360 era, I would say the Resident Evil remake works well on either of those consoles. You could do the Xbox or PS3. Either way is great. Resident Evil 7, I know we mentioned VR earlier. I still think it plays best on PlayStation 4 Pro, but that's because you have the VR option. As far as I know, I don't think it had VR on any of their consoles or platforms, right?
Oh no, because even though like VR peripherals can work on the Xbox One and the HoloLens dev kit will work, there's no games that actually support it on Xbox One. I would say if you want VR PS4 Pro, if you're cool without VR, you're not into VR, it works fine on Xbox One as well, or Xbox One X. That generation, or even the Series X, you can play Resident Evil 7 and you'll have a good time with it. And then like the Series X, like again, the remakes for 1 and 0 work fine on there. Resident Evil 5 works fine. Revelations 1 and 2, they're all Xbox port back and pats here. Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes are made for the Xbox One platform, and Series X technically it's backwards compatible, but it's almost not back compatible anymore because Series X is just anything from the One era is going to be playable moving forward. So they've basically made it so it works on all the new stuff. And the Resident Evil 8, definitely Xbox Series X. I think 'cause that's what I have, but 60 frames per second, ray tracing's activated. You're going to get the best looking game there. On the Series X itself, the S, It does have ray tracing, but you have to turn it on. It's off by default. And the frame rates and user resolution isn't as good as the Series X. So the X and the S are fairly comparable. They both can do 4K, but the X is just a little bit more powerful. Will always give you the best of the best if you play it on the X.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is when it comes to Resident Evil 5 and Revelations, those are co-op online. The reason why we recommend them on Xbox Series X specifically is you can have them on the 360 and the PS3. That's fine. I have them on on the 360, right? But the problem is how long are those servers going to be up? I don't know. I would say the time is limited in terms of that window. You're better off buying them on an Xbox One at the very least, or a PS4. I think that's going to be your better bet in terms of longevity with the game. Although, without getting into it, the CMOS battery on PS4 kind of makes me want to recommend you go Xbox One or Xbox Series X, but that's just kind of my brain telling you for longevity's sake. But those are some main things I want to point out for co-op because they're online only. They're not System Link. I believe they support split screen on the Xbox One ports. I actually don't remember because I haven't bought those yet. But
I think they do on Xbox. I remember people talking about the split screen for it, so I think they do. But hey, these are what we recommend. If you want, like I said, if you want to follow like the main storyline, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you can. And if you don't want to go to the original storyline, just kind of want to start kind of fresh. 7 and 8, it's kind of a fresh story that they're telling. Like I said, I haven't beat 8 yet, and it's but there is a possibility that 8 could then give some exposition and explanation at the end of it that may tie it to the other games. But as far as you see now, you can start with 7 and just go from there. And what limited knowledge you know about 8 or about the original games wouldn't be a huge factor there. But as we said, Resident Evil, this is a franchise that's been around for 25 years, which is kind of incredible. It's kind of very unique in the fact that it's an ongoing story. It has spawned, like we said, multiple movies. They're actually going to be rebooting the movie franchise again here soon. I believe using the same director, Mila Jovovich again, because they're like a husband-wife duo where I think they got married like shortly after Resident Evil 1, and like she's just been in every Resident Evil movie because since then. So it's definitely something that has shaped pop culture and has definitely been influential in almost all horror games across the board since its initial release to be the definitive, hey, this is what survival horror is. And then it's been redefined a few times, and now Resident Evil kind of jumped back in saying, okay, cool. Yeah, survival horror, but hey, people still like to defend themselves, so let's give them a gun instead of just running around with a camera in the dark.
yeah, it's come a long way, that's for sure, from where it's come from, and the fact that it's still around is amazing.
Yep, and with the successful reboot, we could end up seeing another 27 titles just in this storyline franchise. Who knows? It's definitely something that's going to be here to stay, so that's why it's one that we feel like you should definitely check out. But basically, that's our show this week. Thank you for listening. You can find us at forthrightgaming.com, and you can find us on Twitch every week where we'll stream. And then upcoming this week, we're going to be streaming Mass Effect Legendary Edition. So you can find us at twitch.tv/foundattheend, or find us on Twitter at Forthright Gaming, YouTube Forthright Gaming, and definitely on our webpage, www.forthrightgaming.com. If you like what you're listening to, please like and subscribe. You can find our podcasts wherever podcasts are found, like Apple, Alexa, Google Podcasts. We're on just about every platform that is available. So check us out. Let us know. We have a comment section on our webpage where this podcast is posted and uploaded to. So definitely let us know what you think. And we look forward from hearing from you. So see you next time.
Have a good one.